Welcome, everybody. We'll wait till a number of you all get in the webinar and we'll kind of go over our guidelines and then we'll get started with our presentation. And as you're joining, guys, just make sure that you have a strong internet connection. I know some of you may be using Wi-Fi. No matter where you are, just make sure that you're connected to the internet because you will have an assessment quiz after this presentation. And so you will need to have internet access and be signed in with your Wingate email and password. So just ensure that you're connected to the internet. Again, welcome to those who are joining us. Make sure that you are connected to the internet and you have a strong connection. That way that when you receive the assessment quiz at the end, you'll be able to complete that. Also ensure that you're signed in using your Wingate email and password. That way that you can actually get the assessment at the end of this presentation. All right, guys, before we get started, I do want to repeat myself just one more time just to make sure that everyone is aware. Make sure that you have a strong internet connection so that you can get your assessment quiz at the end. Make sure that you're filling the assessment quiz out with your Wingate email and password. That is the only way the system will recognize you. During our presentation, if you are having questions that you want Dr. Kaufman to answer, make sure that you're placing your questions in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Beside of it to the right-hand side is the chat box. We'll use the chat box for any technical issues that you may have. Myself, Abdul, or Samta will be able to help you during the presentation. So again, Q&A is for presentation questions only, and the chat box is for any technical issues. At this time, I'm gonna hand it over to Abdul. He's gonna go over our lyceum guidelines and expectations, and then we'll begin with our presentation.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope everybody is doing great. Okay, we are glad to have you here. And before we begin our presentation, we must go over some housekeeping rules. We ask that your electronic device is fully charged or charging. If your electronic device powers off and you do not receive any assessment quiz, you will not receive credits for the Lyceum event. Also, we ask that you be respectful to your peers and the panelists. Lastly, we ask that you take your time to be immersive, and also reflective. Without further ado, we will hand it over to our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdul. So welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time on a Friday, late afternoon, early evening to come and hear a little bit more about voting and making sure that you are prepared for the upcoming primary and general elections for 2024. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Chelsea Kaufman. I am in the political science department. And I teach all kinds of classes about voting and elections. And it's just really a passion of mine to make sure that you all know how to get registered to vote and where you can find good information if you're interested in participating in the electoral process. So the first thing I actually want to talk about a little bit, because I think that this is something that a lot of students have a lot of concerns about, is, there's a lot of information out there about elections. How do you tell what information's good, what information's bad, where you can even find some of this? So the first thing I want to point out is that there are several different nonpartisan sources, and some of them will even come up with like a local level voter guide that has all different kinds of candidates that are running, not just president, but for, Congress, governor, all kinds of offices. And so I have a few of them listed here. There are more. Vote 411 is published by the League of Women Voters. Ballotpedia is a great resource as well, in addition to having information about what elections are going on. They have a lot of past information as well, where you can look up like who won an election in the past, who is the like what the vote percentages were, what kind of issues are on the ballot, if it's some kind of state that has a ballot initiative, all kinds of information like that. You Can Vote. They are dedicated just to getting out voter education information here for students in North Carolina. They have actually partnered with our campus before. They're going to be here on One Day, One Dog to help with getting students registered to vote. And they have lots of great information for students here in North Carolina. And then finally, these are not the only nonpartisan sources in existence, but these are ones I know of pretty well. And I'm going to be referencing this one quite a lot tonight, which is the State and County Board of Elections. So here in North Carolina, the elections are actually run by like a bipartisan group of people from the state government. And so there's a state level board of elections, and then each county, including Union County, is going to have its own board of elections, and they handle things like the voter registration, all the deadlines, if you needed to go get a voter ID, things like that. Anybody who is a citizen in Union County can go to them as a resource, and they have websites with lots of information as well. And I'm going to be directing you to their websites and showing you some screenshots from there tonight too. Now, let's think a little bit about, those are all nonpartisan sources. They're going to be very informational, just like names of the candidates, if the candidates answered any like interview questions, what the candidate said in response to them, what their party is, have they held office before, just very informational and not meant to give you a perspective on who you should or shouldn't vote for, really. If you need to look into that, one of the things I would say you could look at is actually the candidate websites. Those, of course, are going to oftentimes be biased towards the candidate. The candidate is going to make their own website to promote themselves. But of course, that's going to show you how they want to portray themselves to their voters, what they're saying they stand for, and what they think is important. And so that's what you're going to be looking at in terms of whether you should vote for them or not. Now, of course, you might want other perspectives as well. So sometimes you're going to be able to get that from the news media. Now, if it's a national level election, like for president, you're going to be able to look up all different kinds of information about that in the news, of course. Sometimes even for, there isn't a Senate race in North Carolina this year, but if it was like a high profile Senate race, they might have information in the national news as well. But a really good resource oftentimes is going to be local media for, all of these other smaller offices, which you'll see when I show you a sample ballot later on tonight, that are going to be for our state government and our local government. So oftentimes they will have local level election information with a guide on who all the candidates are and what they've said they stand for, who's endorsed them, things like that. Now, of course, you're going to want to probably research the bias of the media outlet. I don't want to say that you can't use biased media. I think all media probably has a little bit of a bias in one way or the other, but more so that you're aware of what it is. If you are looking at a certain media outlet and it's known to be very conservative, you're going to want to think, okay, do I agree with that viewpoint? Are they portraying this in a way that is very conservative? And do I agree with that? Or vice versa, if it's known to be a very liberal outlet. So you can, of course, read those, but keep those things in mind and what kind of agenda they may be trying to be involved with, and try to sort out, information from what their goals may be. And of course, as I said, there's going to be a lot of other resources as well, but I think that these are some really good places to get started. So your nonpartisan, like voter guides or just the County Board of Elections, just look up who the candidates are on their own websites or on their social media, and then check out your local media to see if they have any kind of guides on the candidates as well. Now, in order to actually vote in the elections here, in North Carolina, or, we can talk a little bit. Some of you in the Q&A may have questions about if you're from another state and you want to vote there instead. But I'm going to be focusing here on voting as a Wingate student registered on campus. If you wanted to vote in the primary elections that are coming up, and it's not just the presidential primary, there's primaries for other offices as well, you need to be registered by February 9th, that's 1 week from today, at 5 p.m. Now, there are several different ways that you can register to vote, and the QR code there on your screen is going to take you to the website that I have here in the screenshot, if you wanted to make sure that you can get that information. So the easiest way for most people is going to be this way that says by mail. Now, I know you all are thinking, well, online would be easier, wouldn't it? In the online registration form, it's going to be based off of the address that's on your North Carolina driver's license or ID. And so therefore, if you wanted to vote as a resident on Wingate's campus, oftentimes that's not going to match. So you need to be, so it depends on whether you wanted to vote at like your permanent address or your Wingate address, because you kind of have to pick one as a college student. And we'll talk about your different options of that there. But for most students, if you want to register to vote and be able to just walk down to the polling place on election day here near campus, you're going to want to fill out the mail form. So follow that QR code. You can print out the form, and then you would mail it into the address that's listed here on the screen. Now, there are also a couple of ways that you can register in person. So you can register at the County Board of Elections office. Their address in Monroe is listed there. Also, if you don't want to print out a form, it lists a bunch of different places where you can usually find forms there too, such as like public libraries. Now, that would be if you wanted to register before February 9th and then vote on election day. The good news is in North Carolina that there's actually a lot of different options for voting, and I'm going to talk more about them in a minute. And one of them is going to be the early voting period that runs from February 15th to March 2nd listed here. And I'm going to talk about how to vote during early voting here in a little bit. But one thing that's really important to remember is if you miss this February 9th deadline, if you show up to early voting in person, you can still register to vote same day. It's just that you need to register by February 9th if you want to request an absentee ballot or vote in person on election day. Otherwise, if you're going to early voting in person, you can register same day. And there will be separate deadlines in the fall as well, and you'll be able to look those up on the Union County Board of Elections website or on the North Carolina State Board of Elections website. But generally, you need to be registered about 30 days in advance or register same day whenever you're at the early voting. Now, in order to actually fill out that registration form, there's going to be some information that is very important, such as your name, who you are, that you are a U.S. citizen, that you are going to be at least 18 on election day, things like that. And you're also going to need to put an address. So if you live on campus and you want to vote in Wingate, this is the address that you would use. Then importantly, remember I said if you go to same day registration that you'll be able to register to vote. You would need to bring two things, which is your Wingate student ID, which you'll probably need anyway. I'll get to that in a minute. And then a school document showing this address. You can get that from the registrar's office. Now, if you register in advance, you don't need that. You're just going to be registered. You're just going to need your ID. As long as everything's going according to plan anyway. But hopefully it would. But you would want to make sure that you use your name at this address, and that you have, if you're registering at same day during early voting, that you bring that document from the registrar's office. A lot of the other information on the form is optional, up to you as to whether you put it in. Like, for example, it'll ask for your email, it'll ask for your gender, it'll ask for your race, ethnicity. You can put those if you want, but the main thing that needs to know is essentially, are you legally allowed to vote in North Carolina, which you have to be a US citizen that is going to be at least 18 on election day. And then some other little things too, like there are regulations on if you are on probation or parole. But generally it's going to be, you are a US citizen, not currently incarcerated, who is 18 on election day. And then they need to know your address so that they know which particular area you vote in. Because remember that, for like president, everybody is going to be voting across the whole state of North Carolina for president. But for things like the congressional races, those are more localized. So I don't live on Wingate's campus, so my member of Congress is different than your member of Congress. And so they need to know exactly where you live so they know which congressional district you're in, so they know who you can vote for that. And then, of course, for the even more local level elections, that is certainly going to matter. Now, that might get back a little bit to why you might want to, let's say that you are from somewhere else in North Carolina, you might want to vote at your permanent address so that you have a say there. Instead, it's kind of up to you as a college student. You can vote either at your permanent address, either by driving back there or voting absentee, or you can vote at your Wingate address. You just have to pick one and register at it. Now, if you are registered to vote on campus, what you can do is on election day, there's a map right here, and you would go down to the Wingate Community Center. The address for it is listed there as well, but you can see where it is. For many people, that is actually going to be walking distance. It's about a 10 to 15 minute walk. Of course, you could drive there as well, but it is within reasonable distance of the campus, and that's going to be open on election day. So both for the primary election day as well as the general election day. And then during the early voting period, those few weeks right before each of the elections, you don't vote at Wingate Community Center, but there are multiple sites in Union County where anybody registered to vote in Union County can go. And the closest one is going to be the library in Marshville. So during early voting, you would go to the library in Marshville or one of those other sites in Union County. They're listed on the Union County Board of Elections website, of course. Or on election day, you would go to the Wingate Community Center if you wanted to cast your vote in person. Now, let's say you don't want to cast your vote in person. In North Carolina, you can vote by mail for any reason. And so if you scan the QR code that's here on this screen, that is going to allow you to get the information about voting by mail. The main thing you have to do for this process is, one, request an actual absentee ballot. So you would need to log in and fill out the request. So first you need to register, then you need to fill out the request form. They will mail this form back to you, and then you can track its status online through a website called Ballot Tracks, and it has all the information about that at the QR code. So basically then there's going to be a deadline that's listed by which you need to mail it back, because they need to receive it within essentially a couple of days of the election. If you had sent it in too late, it's just too late and your vote would not be counted. And I don't think you would want that. But basically you'll be able to track it coming into you, fill it out, and then once you've mailed it back, you're going to be able to track that they've received it as well. You are going to have to follow some rules on how you fill it out so that they can make sure that it is in fact you who is voting, such as including a copy of your ID. And I'm going to get to the ID information more here in a moment. And then having a witness sign that it is essentially you who is voting. Now, they're not supposed to look at who you voted for. They're just supposed to be signing that, yes, you are the person filling out this form and mailing it. You can keep your vote secret from them. They're not certifying who you voted for. So this can be 2 witnesses, which can be almost anyone. There's some restrictions, like you can't, use the candidate who's running for the office to witness your vote for them. But it could be usually like a family member or your roommate or something like that. Or if you go to a notary, it only has to be 1 notary. So 2 regular witnesses or 1 notary witness. And then you would have to sign it as well and include the copy of your identification card or the identification card exception form, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the nice thing about that is that you can track it, and that if for some reason maybe you are out of town or you are sick or you are going to be voting back at your home address, like maybe you live in Wilmington and you don't want to drive all the way back there just to vote, then you could request this and still get your vote in as long as you follow all those rules. And they're going to be all available there at that QR code along with lots of different FAQs. Now, onto the ID requirements. So this is a relatively new requirement here in North Carolina. And so you are generally going to need an ID to vote. There are a few exceptions, and I'll get to those in a second. Now here it shows all the different forms of ID that would be acceptable. So your North Carolina driver's license or state ID. If you had a driver's license from another state, and now you've registered in North Carolina recently, like maybe you just moved here, it's your first year in North Carolina, right? And so you don't have a new driver's license yet, but you've registered to vote here. But of course, if it's a driver's license or ID from another state, that's fine. Your passport would also be fine. And then if you don't have any of those, but you probably will have the last one that I'm going to talk about, you can go to the County Board of Elections and they can get you a free ID card that's good specifically for voting. But now that last one there, it says student and government employee photo IDs approved by the State Board of Elections, and then it says complete list on the following page. I double checked, and Wingate student IDs are included. So you can use your Wingate student ID. Now, what happens if, say, you lost your ID card the day before the election? Of course, you wouldn't maybe have a replacement yet. That's whenever you would be able to do something like fill out a request form whenever you go to vote for the exception situation. So yes, you need an ID, but if some kind of unique situation like that happens, they are still going to consider your vote. You just need to fill out that form. That would also be available, like maybe you're talking to your family and friends. Let's say somebody is really sick, they're homebound, they need to vote absentee, and they can't go to get an updated ID card or something like that. That would be available for somebody in that kind of situation as well. Now, finally, you might be wondering, I think I did register at some point. Did I register? Or once I've registered, how will I know they processed it? It's been received and I'm good to go. The really good news about North Carolina specifically, and it'll be a little bit different if you live in another state and you want to register there, is that we have a really great system where you can check your voter registration status. And I'm going to ask that everybody goes and does this right now. And even if you know you're not registered or you know you are registered for a fact, I still encourage you to do this just so you can get familiar with the system, because it's also going to have lots of other cool and useful information that you might need for the election. Also, whenever you do register the very first time, they will send you a paper card that says you are registered. But if you're anything like me, you might lose that little paper card. You should keep it for your records. But this website's a really good way for you to keep track of it and make sure your registration is still accurate, up to date, and active. But they will send you that paper card for your records. So now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to show you how to use this system. So if you go here to the North Carolina State Board of Elections website, and I had it in the QR code there before, so I'll go back to the QR code for 1 second. Now, what you're going to might be a little bit different than mine, because I'm going to show you for when you don't have the QR code someday how you get here. So if you're on North Carolina State Board of Election, ncsbe.gov, and you go to registering, you can look at checking your registration. And so this is what I had the QR code go to, is this tool. So you're going to want to go there then to launch the voter search tool. And you're going to want to fill out your name. So I'm going to put my name in. And if you had like a really common name, you might want to put some more info, but I know because I've done this many times, there's only 2 Chelsea Kaufmans in all of North Carolina. So you just put your name in, any additional information that you needed, and hit search. This one is me. I am not the inactive one. And so what's really nice is this is going to show all kinds of information. So it's going to show what county you're registered in. It's going to show what your party is. And so UNA, that means that I'm unaffiliated with any party. If you registered Democrat, it would say DEM. If you registered Republican, it would say REP. It's going to show you all of the different places that you can vote for. Like what's your congressional district, what's your North Carolina Senate district, what's your North Carolina House district. And this is going to help you if you are trying to wonder what elections are going to be relevant to me and who is running for those elections. Maybe you look at that local newspaper and you see, oh, wow, there's a lot of different judges that are running for office. Which judicial district do I live in? That's probably not something that most people remember off the top of their heads, right? Like I usually remember things like which congressional district I live in, but I do have to come and double check some of these other things like, okay, what's my school board district and things like that when I'm voting in the local elections. This is also going to show you where you can vote. And so that's going to either let you look up those different early voting sites that are all across your county. Now, of course, you might have noticed I live in Mecklenburg County, so mine's going to be a little bit different than yours. But you can, let's say that you don't want to go to the Marshville Library, you could use that tool to look up the different places in Union County that you can vote during the early voting period. And then it's going to show you specifically where you go to register to vote on election day. If you register with your Wingate address, it will show the Wingate Community Center right there. And you can even click on that to get more information. Now, I think one of the things that's very cool that they have as well is whenever the election's coming up soon, because see, the primary election here in North Carolina is coming up in March on the 5th. And then, of course, we'll have the general election on November 5th. That's too far away. We haven't had the primaries yet, so they don't have the ballots yet. But for the primary elections, they have the Democratic, Libertarian, and Republican ballots. Because I am unaffiliated, if I go in there on March 5th or go during the early voting period to one of the early voting sites, I will get to pick one of those 3. So if you're unaffiliated, it would be the same thing. If you register as a Democrat, you'll get to use the Democratic ballot. If you register as Republican, you'll get to use the Republican ballot. This is just for the primaries where we're choosing who the candidates are for that party. In the general election, you can pick any candidate from any party that you want. And so an example here is I'll click on the Democratic one. And yours, again, will look a little bit different because I live in Mecklenburg County and you live in Union County. But what you can see here is, of course, you know, you might be thinking, well, the primaries don't matter. Look, you can choose to vote for President Biden, or you can, you know, choose to not vote for him. That's the only choice for the Democratic presidential candidate. But look at this, for example, for governor, there are a lot of different choices. For lieutenant governor, there are a lot of different choices. For attorney general, there are a lot of different choices, and so on and so on. And those are all statewide offices. So those would apply to you as well. This is also exactly what your ballot is going to look like when you show up on election day. So this is nice too if you're nervous about that process. Maybe you never voted before, you weren't sure what to expect. Of course, it's probably not going to be paper like this. It'll be on the computer screen, but it's going to be the exact type of thing that you're going to encounter. Is it's going to say the name of the office and then list the candidates and then tell you things like you may vote for one. This is important because there's nothing, oh, here, there is one like this in my election this time that you could pick 3 and then the top 3 candidates will win. Now, of course, I'll show you also the Republican one. You can see here, of course, there are more Republican nominees for president to choose from. And then there are also options there for governor, lieutenant governor, and these other statewide offices as well. And so you are going to have a lot of different choices in the primary. Then in the general election, of course, it will have whoever wins these offices. So for example, presumably considering many of these candidates for president have dropped out, you would be able to choose, it would say presidential preference, and then it would say Joseph Biden and Donald Trump in the 2024 general election. And as well as all of these other offices, like whoever is nominated to be the gubernatorial candidates for the Democrats and Republicans and the Libertarians and so on. But I think that this is really great because if you're nervous about like, what's it going to be like? What am I going to encounter when I get there? You can see this right here. And if you're having trouble figuring out who the candidates are, one of the things I'll do for some of these local elections where I don't know who these people might be, like I follow the news, I'm a political science professor. I know who like Ron DeSantis is, but I don't know who's Chris Freeman, right? That's running for the North Carolina appeals judge, seat 15. That's not something I know off the top of my head, but now I can look him up or her up, right? And so I know this person's name, I know what they're running for, so I can like Google that and start to look through local news, their campaign website, their social media, anything they have like that, so that I can get more information going all the way back to what I had said at the beginning. Now, the final really cool thing on this website is it's going to show you your voter history. So I'm older than most of you, so I have more voter history. But what it shows you here, now it doesn't record who you vote for. Where it says Democratic or Republican here, that's not who I voted for. That's which primary election I chose. So remember I had the different sample ballots for Democratic primary and Republican primary. This was me choosing to vote in different primaries. For the general elections, you'll see that it doesn't list party because of course you can vote for whoever you want to and your vote is secret. It won't be tied to your name. And so, but what you can see here is it shows what day I voted or what election I voted for and then how I voted. Did I vote in early voting or did I vote in person on election day? And if you voted by absentee, that's where it's going to show your absentee ballot came back in as well. And so you can make sure that your vote was in fact recorded because I know that they have a record that I went on November 7th, 2023 and voted. So I know that this occurred and that they didn't like lose track of my vote. And so I think that this is really helpful information to have as well, especially if you're voting absentee and you want to make sure everything made it back. Now, if you're already registered, you might be wondering, what can I do to help my friends, my family, people I know? So I think the biggest thing is to remind people to register and help them with the process. I just spent 30 minutes talking about the process. It can be confusing and intimidating. So you can tell them about all their different options to vote. Maybe they're afraid, oh, I will have to work on election day. Remind them about early voting, remind them about absentee ballot. Maybe they're afraid of using absentee ballots because they're afraid it'll get lost in the mail or tampered with. Remind them they can go in person to early voting or on election day, right? You can tell them about all the different parts of the process and help them make a plan to vote. Make sure that they actually are saying, okay, well, during early voting, I have off Wednesdays and I'm going to go on a Wednesday afternoon during early voting, right? If they have that level of specificity with their plan and they've talked to you about it, it's a lot less likely that they're just going to forget. If they aren't sure that they're registered to vote, you can show them the voter lookup tool so that they can check their status. And then if they are registered, great. Make sure that they're registered at the correct address. They know where to go. They know who's on the ballot for them, all of those different kinds of things. If they're not registered, then you can help them with the registration process. You can help them download the form, print it out, and get it mailed back in. And then maybe you are feeling a little bit out of your depth. You have a lot of questions or concerns, and you are remembering that there's resources from this lyceum, but you're not sure exactly what all the details were. Remember that organizations like You Can Vote, they have a lot of information on their website that's tailored to North Carolina student voters, and it's going to be very helpful to you. And then, of course, if all else fails, just remember the State and County Board of Elections. They run the elections. They have all of the information. They have all of the dates. They have all of the laws. They have all of the deadlines. They're going to have that voter lookup tool. It is extremely useful and is going to be a great resource to you. I did mention that if you are voting in another state, that yours might be a little bit different. So keep in mind that's a state office. So in some states, they're going to have like their own state board of elections. So you would look for that state's name and board of elections whenever you search for it online. Or sometimes their Department of State runs it. So you might look for like that state's name, Department of State elections, that state's name, Secretary of State elections, something like that. So some states it's called a board of elections. Some states it's called the Secretary of State's office. So those are what you're going to want to look up if you want to make sure of what all the rules and regulations are in your particular state. Because of course, here in the US, every single state and territory has its own voting laws that are specific. And so these that I've talked about today really only apply to North Carolina, which is where you are all at least temporarily living. But you might be thinking, well, I want to vote back in Georgia. I want to vote back in California. I want to know what to do then. You would need to go and look the information up there. A lot of it will be similar. Like you'll have to register to vote. You'll have to follow some deadlines. You'll have to show up to some kind of voting location. But lots of little details will change. Like what kind of IDs are acceptable? What are the hours of the polling places? Is there early voting? How many days does it last? All of those things vary state to state to state. All right, I know that was a lot of information. Probably some of you have had some questions. So now I'd like to take the second half to just answer any questions that you all may have.
And again, remember, you can put your questions in the Q&A box for us. Dr. Kaufman, I'll ask the first question. For someone who this is their first time getting involved in voting, and there's so much that the media can portray or present, and it could be overload, what is some tips for them in trying to sift through that information to make the right choice if they are wanting to vote?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know it can be extremely overwhelming. You have information coming at you from the TV, from the internet, from social media. You have maybe your parents telling you one thing, your friends telling you another thing. And I would say that I usually tell students whenever they're assessing any kind of information that the first thing you're going to want to do is consider what the source is. So, is this some sort of legitimate news source that you've heard of? Now, if not, I mean, don't dismiss it completely out of hand. It's just, you're going to kind of need to do a little bit more research. If it is a regular, like legitimate news source, you're still going to want to consider that doesn't mean you just automatically accept it. You're going to want to think, kind of like I said earlier, does this have a more liberal bias? Does this have a more conservative bias? What does that mean for me? Or, and so again, you can't trust 100% of everything they say. They might have their own agenda behind this as well. And you don't want to dismiss something just because you aren't sure that this is a legitimate news source, but you would want to dig in deeper and find out, okay, who are these people? Are they experts on this topic? Are they journalists? Is this just a news company I never heard of before? I think a good example would be I would say don't just get your information from TikTok, but what if you were watching a TikTok from a person who works for a news organization? Or what if you were watching a TikTok from a political science professor, right? So if you dug into that a little deeper and found out that information, you might find out that they're a good source. So once you know that your source is probably okay, probably legitimate, you've accounted for any of their biases they may have, think about what they're actually telling you. Are they trying to just tell you information about the election? Are they trying to persuade you to vote one way or the other? And then given that, what kind of evidence do they have? So if they are trying to persuade you of something, what evidence have they put forward? Is it actually something that makes sense? And so I think then the final thing would be to think about what they kind of conclude in light of what those biases were. Have they just kind of maybe cherry picked evidence in order to back themselves up? Are they saying something that could be misleading? Does it match up a little bit, at least, with what other sources are saying about the same topic? And I know that this sounds like a lot of work, but with how much misinformation is out there, I think it's really important to go through all of this, especially if you are struggling. The other thing, of course, too, would be, try to figure out then once you get a little more practice at this, okay, what are your trusted sources? and still kind of go through these steps with them, but it's going to be a little bit easier because you're going to know source A, I usually agree with them. I usually think their evidence is good. I usually think they make sense. I know maybe they lean a little bit this way or a little bit that way, but I can account for that. And then just if maybe something comes up that you think sounds a little bit too good to be true or a little bit too bad to be true, or is going to be like in line with some of their biases or agendas, then that's when maybe you start to search out some other sources as well.
Thank you for that. I think we do have
Yeah, of course.
3 other questions in the Q&A box that we have.
Okay,
Something you want to go ahead?
fantastic.
Yeah, I can go
Yes.
ahead. So the first question says, to be able to register to vote, would these steps only apply in North Carolina?
Yes, that's correct. So if you did want to register to vote in another state, it's going to be very similar steps. You're going to be able to go to either their Board of Election website or their Secretary of State website, and there will either be an online application or a form you can print out and mail in. You can also, in whatever state you're in, usually at places like the post office or the DMV or the libraries, they're going to have the forms that you can mail back.
And the second question is, if I'm registered in one area but want to vote in Wingate for college, we would have to register in Wingate. If I want to switch back to my hometown registration when I graduate, do I have to re-register again?
Yes. So the way that this student has described the process is correct. So if you want to vote in Wingate for now, you'd have to re-register here. Then you could keep voting here at Wingate. You wouldn't have to re-register in Wingate every single year. But then whenever you move back to your hometown, or maybe you move to another town for a job after graduation, you will have to re-register there. And so every time you move, actually, you have to re-register. So, for example, many of you probably moved from like a parent or guardian's home into your apartment or residence hall here on campus. But whenever you graduate and you have a job, or maybe you've had experience with this in the past, you might be moving around to a bunch of different apartments. So for example, since I moved to Charlotte, I've lived in 3 different houses. And so every single time, even though I lived in Charlotte the whole time and never left Charlotte, I had to re-register because it's a different address. And so even tiny little things like what school board or city council district I'm in is going to change. So even somebody who's like from Monroe and living in a residence hall would have to re-register in Monroe whenever they graduate and move back.
And the third one, it says, sometimes my friends who don't vote will always say that they don't vote because their vote doesn't matter or won't make a difference. How would you answer or explain to them?
That is a great question. I think one reason I'm so passionate about voting and making sure that every student, regardless of who they are and what they think about politics, is engaged in it is that one of the things is, okay, you might look at those elections and say, this candidate won by so many millions of votes, or this candidate lost by so many millions of votes. What difference could my one vote make? But an important thing to keep in mind is that if you don't vote, there is no way for your say to be heard. Now, of course, there are some things like you could write into them, you could go to a protest, you could spread awareness on social media. But the main way that a politician who's running for office is going to get a say from you as to whether they should have that office or not is by you voting. If you don't, you literally have no say. So maybe they won't listen to you if you vote, but if you don't vote, they can't listen to you. Also, there are going to be certain elections. So one reason I pointed out that it's not just the presidential elections, but there's a lot of state and local elections as well, is those can be much closer races. And you can really have quite a bit of say there. So just last November, for example, there was an election in Monroe for the mayoral race, and the election was tied. They ended up deciding who would be the mayor of the city of Monroe with a coin flip. So in an election like that, you truly can make a difference. And so if you think about it, if a student was like, I'm from Monroe, but I don't really think that my vote on who's going to be mayor is going to matter. I hope it's this guy, not this guy. That single vote really could have made a difference. And especially in local elections, the turnout rate is very, very low, maybe like 10 to 15%. So it's very common that this type of thing will come up.
Okay. The next question says, if I live in a different state, but go to school out of state, I have to do a mailed vote, correct? Due to my license saying I am a Georgia resident.
So as a college student, you would have two options. The first option would be exactly what you described. If you want your vote to be for, you gave the example of Georgia, for the elections in Georgia, you would need to either vote by mail in Georgia or drive back to Georgia and vote in person. Probably the vote by mail is a little bit more convenient than driving back. However, you also are allowed to register at your campus address. So if you live here at Wingate on campus, then you can register using that address that I listed earlier in the presentation. I'll go back to it so that you have it. And then you would register and you would vote here. You would vote at the community center. But then your vote would count towards our local congressional district and things like that. So it depends on, do you want your vote to be going towards like the Georgia presidential race, the Georgia races for Congress, the Georgia races for their state house and their state senate, or do you want that for North Carolina? You have to pick one. So college students can either do their permanent home address or their college address.
Does anybody have any further questions they want to ask? If so, you can put it in the Q&A box.
I have a question. So what if probably a day before election, something changes, your location changes, or you have to go somewhere? Can you still vote like with a temporary document that shows it?
Yeah, so if you are in kind of a unique situation, because generally with voter registration and where you're voting, you have to live in the place for 30 days in order to vote. But let's say that this hasn't been like fully processed yet or something like that. So it has to be at least 30 days, but maybe you haven't gotten everything changed over. You may be able to request something called a provisional ballot whenever you show up to vote. Now that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be considered, but they would consider it, or they would it doesn't guarantee it'll be counted, but it would be considered. So this would be for a person who maybe they moved down the street and they go to their old polling place because their stuff hasn't been changed over to the new polling place. They don't know where it is yet, things like that. And I think that that's the type of scenario you're describing, is that you moved really, really close to that 30 days before the election. But that's one reason there is a registration cutoff, is because you have to live in the place for at least 30 days.
One last call for questions for Dr. Kaufman. If there aren't any further questions, Dr. Kaufman, do you have any closing remarks that you want to give to students, any links, or revisit the NC board website just one more time for them?
Yes, I will show them that one more time because I think it's so important. So
Yes.
if you want to look any of this information up, it's North Carolina State Board of Election.gov. And then I will also put, you can always email me or stop by and see me. I have an office in Burris. I'm going to put in the chat my email address.
Perfect.
Okay, I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Okay, how can people who have no idea about the candidates decide who to vote for?
That is a great question. My biggest recommendation would be first, you remember how on here, once I did the voter search, I could bring up my sample ballot like this? Like, let's say that you're like, who are these people that are running for the Republican nomination for North Carolina governor? I have never heard of them before in my life. One of the things I would recommend is maybe the very first thing you do is go and check out how they are portraying themselves in their campaign materials. So just go and like Google their name, see what's on their social media, see what's on their own websites. Now, of course, they're going to be portraying themselves as positively as possible, but you're going to also see they're going to say what their policy positions are. And so then do you agree with those policy positions that they are putting forward? You could also then, once you maybe get an idea, like, okay, maybe these people sound okay, but I'm still having some trouble, maybe then start looking at like local news sources or something like that to see, okay, did they have any like Q&As with the candidates? Is there a summary of any debates that they had? Maybe even for national level elections, there might be debates. Like, so just earlier this week, there was a Republican candidate primary debate for Congress at Wingate University, right? So you might be able to find coverage of something like that where it summarized some of the things that they said. And so you're going to have to decide for yourself in the end which things matter to you and your core values and beliefs. But that's going to be able to be found either through how the candidates portraying themselves or the types of things that they're saying out in the media.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
If there's no additional questions, Dr. Kaufman, I do want to extend my token of appreciation for giving this insightful presentation to our students. And guys, I hope that you actually take something from this presentation, and I hope that you are active in making a difference in our country as well. Getting engaged, I know that sometimes it could be a hesitation, but you got to start somewhere. So I do appreciate you giving us that insight. And as well, you have her information in the chat box. So if you do want to write that down and kind of contact her if you have any personal questions, maybe you didn't want to share in the group, that is fine. Samto is going to share the assessment quiz. This quiz will give you your credit, so make sure that you complete it entirely and press submit. If there's nothing else, Dr. Kaufman, that you have to say, I am going to conclude this presentation tonight. But we do thank you so much. Samto, Abdul, thank you guys as well. Samto and Abdul will stay on the webinar for 5 additional minutes so that you guys can complete the assessment. Again, if you have any technical problems, please message them in the chat box. If it supersedes them, they can contact me and we'll get you squared away. I hope everybody has a good evening.
Yes, have a great evening. Thank you so much for having me for the Lyceum, for giving your attention to the Lyceum. And I do really just want to second the recommendation to make sure to get involved, get engaged, learn about what's going on. As I said before, you might feel like your vote doesn't make much difference, but if you don't vote, it's even harder to make a difference. Have a great night, everybody.
Abdul, Samto, if you guys need me, please message me if you're having any technical issues, okay?
Okay,
All right. Have a good evening.
okay, thank you. You too.
Okay, I hope everyone has completed the form, and soon we'll be closing the webinar. You all have a good day. I hope you
Okay, see you, man. See you.
see you. Demir, do you have any issue with the link, or you're good? I'll be closing the webinar in a minute, so just wanted to make sure that you got the link and you're good. Okay, I hope you have a good night. I'm closing the webinar now. Good night.